Welcome to another part of the Big Gay Week here at the Wheeler Centre. Tonight's session is called Coming Out Stories. My name's Richard Watts and I'll be your host for the evening. Before we get underway, so obviously tonight the session that we're here to discuss, the theme is coming out stories. Sexual identity and public acceptance, as we know, aren't always easy bedfellows. And we have 4 guests here to share their personal accounts of the process of coming out, of telling loved ones, friends, and indeed the wider world that you sometimes identify as different or other to what people may have thought about you. So they'll each speak for 3 to 5 minutes and then we'll have a bit of a chat amongst ourselves, and at the end of the evening we'll throw the questions open to the floor to hear from all of you as well. So please welcome our very first speaker. Virginia Lovett is the General Manager of the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. She's also worked as an advisor to the Carr Labor government in New South Wales. She's been on numerous boards, including Sydney's Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, Legs on the Wall and Craft Victoria. And please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. My family motto, loosely translated, is deny, denial and deny more. I was an only child and I grew up in Beaumaris with my 2 unmarried aunts. One was bipolar, compulsive gambler, lived quite a different double life. The other woman yearned for a different life, and then there was my mother. And looking back, I had a pretty carefree childhood, blissfully unaware of any family problems, which were quickly covered up or never really spoken about. My father was a journalist and he never lived with us. As the story went, he had to live closer to work, and as a child I thought that's pretty feasible. He didn't drive, we were on the beach, he liked a beer and he worked a lot. Then in 1975, one of my aunts whisked me off to Disneyland on one of those new fandangled holiday packages, Hawaii, Las Vegas and Anaheim. And back home my parents were getting one of those quick new fandangled divorces. So life changed out of the blue. I came home from school one day and we were moving out. My mother was moving in with someone and I was given 3 choices. You can stay with the aunts, you can go with your father, who I didn't really know, or you can come with me. So of course I went with my mother down the road to a new life. Not the happiest of times. My aunts had some weird custodial visiting rights, like Friday and Saturday nights I'd go over there. At 16, my father died and no one told me he'd been in the hospital. He'd been there for 3 months, so I got there 3 days before he died. And he'd had a stream of visitors the days I was there, and one visitor came in and said, you know, Harry, can you take a message to the other side? And he looked up and he said, take your own bloody messages. My mother died a couple of years later, when I was about 21, and she had, again, the denial. She had ignored the cancer, which was now throughout her body. We never spoke of it. Even as she lay dying, it was never spoken of. So after my parents died, I had to leave uni and I found a job, and I moved out of the burbs to St Kilda into a share house and a new freedom, really. And it is here at this share house that I met my first love. For both of us, it was our first gay relationship, and for me, it was my first real relationship. And when she left, it was gut-wrenchingly painful. So I moved to Sydney. What a revelation. It was like Babylon. Everyone was so gay, or so it seemed. No one knew my past, and I pretty much reinvented myself north of the Murray as out and proud. And working in the arts was and is a very supportive and positive and accepting environment. And so I count myself very fortunate to have never experienced any kind of prejudice from friends nor peers. My contact with my aunts became weekly weather reports. What's the weather like up in Sydney? Oh, no, but my life was an utter mystery to them. They were not sure of what I did, and I seemed to have a number of really good female friends who were willing to put me up in their homes. Then I met someone. She was Catholic and married and had been brave enough to face her family and come out. So in about 1997, I decided it was time to tell the aunts. They were what remained of my family. And I'd supported them through death, suicide attempts, sickness, electric shock treatment. I'm sure they were going to support me. So one weekend, I flew to Melbourne, and with a number of wines under my belt, I launched into it. I've met someone that I think I love. Is it Alan? No, it's not Alan. How many times do I have to tell you Alan is gay? It's Jane. You met her last time we were down. We're moving in together. The silence was utterly terrifying. And then my aunt said, I'm not talking about this. It's disgusting. It's not happening. You don't know what you're talking about, and I never want to talk about it again. My compulsive gambling aunt's only comment for this momentous occasion was different horses for different courses. And so it was never spoken of again, filed away with other stuff they were unwilling to face or talk about. Not sure if it's just me just getting a bit older or a bit mellower, but it doesn't matter to me anymore. In their own way, they accept and love my partner of many years, not the Catholic one. And we see them every second week or so, and one always asks if Rose has a boyfriend yet, or whatever happened to that boy you were going to marry, Virginia. He's gay. How many times do I have to tell you? And I have no idea what they make of us, two 40-plus gay ladies going overseas, buying property, cat, dog. Maybe they think Mr. Right is just around the corner. Denial can be deeply annoying, but I have been true to myself, and I'm very happy. My aunt's lunchtime observations about the gays and was Julia Gillard Rudd's secretary, and why don't you have a male boss? And that new tennis player on the TV has a touch of the Billie Jeans is now just fodder for dinner party stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Our next speaker is Melbourne's own award-winning Wes Snelling, who's been working within the arts industry for over a decade as an actor, singer, writer, comedian, director, production, stage, tour manager and facilitator. He's a fabulous cabaret star, has a beautiful voice and a very wicked sense of comic timing. Please make Wes Snelling very welcome.
Hello. Yes, my name is Wes. I grew up at in the Kyneton Caravan Park, which is about an hour out of Melbourne, with my family. My parents got divorced when in my teens, and I stayed there with my dad and my two brothers. My mum moved to Melbourne, and had a great time growing up there. I felt sick for most of the time I was there because I felt like there was something kind of wrong with me, but we'll get to that. When I was 19, I was living in St Kilda in a share house, and I was there with a bunch of friends. And why is that funny?
No, you were in the same share house as me.
Oh yeah, we all share the same house. We were in this share house, and technically I came out to a group of friends in a game of Truth or Dare. You know, it was like Have you ever thought of someone else of the same sex sexually like that? And it was like, yes, I have, and that was great. And then that was the first experience of coming out. The next one happened coincidentally because I was very attracted to a boy that I met at the Astor Theatre, and I, in fact, fell in love with him after one day, and I was at the Prince of Wales one night, and he was there, and I went up to him and I said, "Will you go out with me?" And he said, "No," and I started bawling my eyes out on the steps of the Prince of Wales, and completely coincidentally, my brother walked up at that time and gave me a hug, and he said, "What's wrong?" And I said, I've just lost the love of my life." And he said, "What's his name?" And I just was so relieved that he knew, he just knew. And so I put that aside and didn't really think about it much more. I ended up talking that particular boy, we'll call him David, because that's his name. The boy we ended up falling in love. I ended up convincing him to love me. And it got to a point where I realised that I wanted him to be a part of my family. I wanted to be able to take him home to my dad's house in the country and like my brothers take their girlfriends home and be a part of our family. So I thought, let's start with Mum. She lives in Melbourne. She's a bit savvy. So I took her out for dinner at the Gladstone Park Hotel and Tabaret, and said, "Mum, I've got something to say. I'm gay. And she said, oh, I know that. Yes. I knew when you used to, put on my heels when you were 5 years old, and I'd say, let's get those off. Your dad's coming down the driveway. So she knew. That was a relief. And so next was my oldest brother, Darren, and I took him out for dinner as well to a pub in Sunbury, and told him, and he started crying and just said, I love you no matter what. So that felt very special. And saving the most complicated person till last, my father, I decided to take a trip up to the country, and coincidentally it was actually Pride March Day, which I only realised today that's the day it was. But went up there, stayed up there, and I said, at the time, by the way, I was working at a bar. I was working behind the bar at the Arts Centre and studying drama at Rusden. And I went, saw my dad and said, Dad, I've got something to tell you. And it was the most nerve-wracking experience ever. And he said, what? And I said, I smoke. And he said, well, we're going to have to do something about that. And I said, and I'm gay. And he just glared at me for about what felt like about 10 minutes and then said, is it because you work at the Arts Centre? I said, no, I'm actually in love with someone and I'd love for you to meet him. And he dealt with that really well. It took him a while to actually meet him and come around and get that, process happening. I remember about 2 months after I told him, I got a phone call saying, hi Wes, I was reading the paper today and there was a gay person in it. Thanks, Dad. Thanks, Dad. And as now he's absolutely 100% supportive, and it just took him a bit of time. That's my coming out story. Thank you.
Before I introduce our next speaker, I'm just going to briefly share with you something of my own coming out story in the form of a cautionary tale. Don't come out to your gossipy sister first, because she will then tell the rest of your family for you and all of your friends, which is slightly inconvenient when it's 1985 and you live in Moe. And when you do then formally and officially come out to your parents, don't do it in a restaurant where they can't then actually talk about it in any kind of way. I did that while my dad had gone to the loo. I turned to my mum and said, right, I know it's Dad's birthday and everything, but it's going to be my coming out party as well, okay? I already know you're gay, Megan told you. And she just turned slightly pale and drank more wine. Dad came back, I did the same thing, and then we didn't talk about it for the rest of the night. It was a very quiet drive home, no questions were asked. It was a really, really bad and awkward way to do it. And for quite some time, my mother in particular was uncomfortable with the very idea of raising my sexuality. For example, when one of my first boyfriends, she rang me and made a point of saying, you can't bring him home for Christmas, your grandfather won't understand, which I knew was actually her not understanding. But within maybe 5 years or so of that, I know that she'd started to come around because she sent me a newspaper clipping from her small country town, Numurkah, where she lived, talking about the gay musical Prodigal, which had been written by a young student from Numurkah High School. When she sent me that, I realised that the ice had really started to thaw and that we could actually start to have a warm relationship again. The most recent time I came out was to 3 Collingwood supporters at a tram stop about 2 weeks ago. I'm also a Collingwood supporter, I should point out, so it was kind of safe for me to do so. But allow me now to introduce our next guest, writer, director, filmmaker Anna Kokkinos, whose career spans film, television. She was honoured at the Seattle International Film Festival just last year as an emerging master filmmaker. You may know her films such as Blessed, Head On, The Book of Revelation, and her extraordinary short-ish 40-minute film, Only the Brave, which was the first work of hers that I saw and still kind of resonates with me to this day. Please welcome Anna Kokkinos.
Thanks, Richard. Well, I guess coming out, it sort of never stops. Coming out never ceases. I think we were talking about this in the green room. You come out to your family, you come out to your friends, but in some ways you're constantly coming out to the wider world. So I thought I'd just give you two simple moments from my story. A few years ago I was invited to attend a screening of one of my films at the Byron Bay Writers' Festival. And as it sounded like it would be fun, my partner Mira decided to come along as well. And I was also there with my producer and the co-writer. So we all flew into Byron together, but the arrangements for the trip had been made through the film's distributor. And when we were invited to the opening reception of the Writers' Festival, it was a fairly big event and it was all kind of very official. And we arrived at the venue, we filed in through doors, and all the sort of the special guests or the invited guests were actually given name tags. So my name tag naturally read Anna Kokkinos. Al Clark, the producers, read Al Clark, and Andrew Bovell's read Andrew Bovell. Mira's name tag, however, read Anna's husband. As they hadn't checked on who my partner was, to them it seemed like a very sensible thing to do. Now, of course, the feminist in me was delighted, and despite the organisers, who I have to say were rather mortified, attempting to rectify the name tag, we all insisted that Mira should wear it. And in fact, I believe that Mira has the name tag to this day. Coming out to my family was hard. I was 20, my parents were at my sister's place for dinner, and my sister was heavily pregnant at the time. I'd been building up to it for ages, and on this particular night, I felt that I needed to sort of blurt it out, get it over with, actually say it. I'd given my sister the heads up that I was about to do it, and at the last moment I hesitated, feeling sick, sweating, butterflies in my stomach, and I spent the whole night avoiding it. And then when I was on the brink of saying it, when there seemed to be a moment where I could casually introduce the idea into the conversation, I kept pulling back. All night there were furtive glances across the dinner table between my sister and I. At some point she glared at me and she mouthed the words, "Go on, just say it." This kept happening at various intervals through the course of dinner, and of course I kept chickening out. But finally, as we cleared the table, my sister whispered to me, "I thought you were going to say something." And I furtively again shook my head, and at this time she kind of stared me down. Then she shoved me in the back and said, "You have to do it." And so then at that moment I blurted it out. The words came out of my mouth. "I've got something to tell you, Mum and Dad." And in a strangled voice I finally said, "I like women. I really like women. I'm a lesbian." I can't remember who spoke first. In fact, I can't remember if anyone said anything at that point. My father rose from his chair with a ferocious look on his face. That I do remember. I do remember glimpsing my mother's contorted face. As my father lurched towards me, I started running. Around the kitchen, around the dining table, round and round I went as my father chased me, hands outstretched, ready to strangle me. There may have been screaming, there may have been some wailing, there may have been some crying. But as I ran, I do remember thinking at the time, my God, this isn't going as well as I'd hoped. This went on for what seemed like an absolute eternity. The running, the ducking and the weaving, until finally I found myself kind of chased into a corner, somewhere between the TV and the back door. As Dad raced towards me, my heavily pregnant sister stepped in front of me at the last minute and thrust her pregnant belly at him and said, "Over my dead body." This had the momentary effect of stopping him, and I used the opportunity to grab my keys and flee the house. It's not that we didn't talk about it in the days that followed. We did. But then a silence descended, and the delicate question of my sexuality didn't get raised again for another 8 years. It's not that we became estranged or that they cut me out of the family. It's just that an unspeakable chasm opened up between us. The next time we spoke about it was when I introduced them to my partner, Mira. The acceptance of the relationship, although initially tentative, did grow. And this time at least, there was no attempt to strangle me, which was kind of just as well, because it would have been a bit off-putting for Mira in those early romantic days. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Our final speaker tonight is the writer Tom Cho. Tom's stories have appeared in magazines, journals and anthologies in Australia and internationally. He's also performed at festivals around the country, including in the award-winning show Hello Kitty. He's won grants and awards for his fiction and is currently completing a PhD in professional writing. Please make him very welcome.
Thank you. That bio is a little bit old, actually. I finished my PhD, and that's something that it's funny, but I don't often come out about having a PhD. It's one of these strange things. This is relevant, by the way, to what I'm going to say, but I never intended to go into academia anyway, so I decided that I would not really change my documentation to reflect doctor. But it's a strange thing because I just have this little habit of that I like to disclose that I have a PhD on completely irrelevant occasions, such as when joining a video library or something like that. It occurred to me when I was writing, gathering my thoughts for this session, that I thought if only I could approach coming out as a bit more of a game like that, where I could disclose at any sort of oddly irrelevant time that I care to. I haven't really prepared a sort of very chronological, from the age of 4 I knew type story, and in fact I actually feel some ambivalence about the notion of coming out and the genre of coming out stories, and so I also wanted to discuss a little bit about that. When I said to some people that I was going to be speaking at this event, and they said to me, "Oh, you're going to be telling your coming out story." A few wiser people said to me, "Which coming out story are you going to tell?" Which was, I think, a apt question. But the fact that they said you're going to be telling your coming out story and expressing it in the singular like that actually points to me. Reinforces to me about some of the objections I have to coming out stories as a genre. The fact that it's presumed that there is one story and one version of this story. Coming out stories can have a sort of a monolithic feel in that sense, and as stories can be have a sort of closed-endedness, which for ideological reasons and even artistic reasons doesn't always appeal to me. It's said that coming out stories can be challenging of heterosexuality as some kind of assumed norm, and so therefore to come out as any orientation other than heterosexual achieves this goal. But perhaps coming out stories also arguably create their own sort of master narrative, with very familiar plot points. From the age of 4 I knew. Some catalysing incident occurs, obstacles appear, epiphanies occur as well, culminating in some kind of sense of affirmation of one's sexual orientation, and really a sense of closure. But, as it's been remarked already, but coming out might be seen to be an ongoing process, and in my case, I can certainly testify that I feel no great sense of closure. I've also been ambivalent about the notion of coming out as being a political duty. And I know that's very deeply entwined with the notion of pride, and that you're meant to come out and be out loud and proud. But I must admit that I feel some sense of objection to this, because it's so deeply entwined with the notion of pride. If one chooses to not come out, I think it gets linked to this fallacy that if you opt to not disclose, then somehow you must not be proud and therefore you must be ashamed. Which actually reminds me of the case of a friend of mine who chooses not to go to the gay and lesbian pride march. and says that instead, she's a lesbian, and she says that instead she prefers every year to hold her own shame and self-loathing march. And, you know, in my own way, I can relate to that. Just a few more comments. I find coming out to be an interesting phrase, and the discourse around coming out suggests that you're in by default, that you're assumed to be something that is the norm, in the case of sexual orientation, heterosexual, unless you disclose otherwise. But I wonder if it's in fact possible to be out and in at the same time, or what if you're sure if you're not out to someone? Can you be therefore out without knowing it? I'm sure you can. And can you be in without knowing it? I suspect so as well. And for example, I could certainly speak about my sexual orientation, but I will say that once upon a time I used to go by another name and another gender. But I'm also a writer, and before gender transition happened, I was a writer then as well. And this is the one little personal account that I'll tell you about. But I remember one of the hardest aspects about disclosing my gender identity happened actually in the writing world. It's very difficult when you've got a previous name and more than a decade of publications. And I gave my first reading as Tom Cho. I can't remember what year it was. And it was at the launch of a literary magazine called Going Down Swinging, and so the editors introduced me. This is Tom Cho giving a reading, and I stood out in front of a whole bunch of my peers, colleagues, some of them who I'm sure were very surprised to hear me being introduced by another name. And I was quite nervous, didn't show it, and at the reading seemed to go sort of well. And at the end, you know, I remember someone came up to me and she was like, "Oh, you know, I loved your reading. It was great, and your style is so fresh, you know." And she basically clearly thought that I was a newcomer to the writing world, and said, "Oh, you know, I'd like you to appear in such and such a festival." And I did think to myself, should I tell her that I in fact had been around in the writing world for a long time now? But I decided that I wouldn't. But in that room, there were people who may have already known about the fact that I was beginning a gender transition, and there were others who did not. And so, in a way, I guess I felt like I was in and out at the same time. And so I guess finally I should say that the whole notion of in/out doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. It's a spatial metaphor that really doesn't resonate with me. When I was preparing this talk, I was wondering to myself, could I change that somehow? What could I change in/out to? And I wondered if perhaps it might be on/off, and if we could replace the closet with a power switch, if you like. And in that sense, maybe my switch has always been set to on, and maybe I've always been queer and always will be, and I've always been male and always will be. But in fact, that's even though it's a very persuasive in some ways and attractive position to take, actually it's that if I was to say that to you, to claim that to you, that would be suggesting a sense of certainty that I don't really have. So the only way I can really take that metaphor is to tell you that when I was a kid, I used to flick on and off my bedroom light to create what I thought at the time were very interesting disco lighting effects. And really, if anything, maybe that's a bit more about the kind of space that I'm in, that in a sense I'm still that kid who's flicking the light switch on and off to create some interesting effects. Thank you.
Now, just before we move into the next part of our discussion, first of all, John Boy is going to move the lectern so we can all sit and chat amongst ourselves. And while that's going on, thank you, John Boy. Tonight, as I mentioned at the start of the evening, is part of the Big Gay Week here at the Wheeler Centre, which started on Sunday night with Armstead Maupin at the Athenaeum Theatre, and which finishes on Friday with literary speed dating. Now, there has been a change to the program for this week's event. Dennis Altman unfortunately can't speak tomorrow at the Lunchbox Soapbox talk as scheduled. So the Wheeler Centre instead has been lucky enough to get Helen Razor to speak tomorrow. Helen will be expanding upon her somewhat controversial piece that was recently published in The Age, discussing the conundrum of queer culture and the value of the ghetto. And certainly I saw some fairly feisty discussion on Facebook and Twitter in response to that particular article. So Helen's talk is entitled Giving Up on Art and will be taking place here at the Wheeler Centre this Thursday at 12:45. And then Thursday and Friday night is literary speed dating for the men on Thursday and for women on Friday. Check out the website for more details. I'm thinking of coming along on Thursday night and bringing one of my favourite books. I just don't know which one yet. And I have to try and work out how to out myself as a reader. Am I the serious reader? Am I the collector of first editions? Or do I bring along a comic book?
You can be versatile, you know, Richard.
But this is one of the things about coming out. It does seem to a point, ask you to be something rather than a multitude of somethings. Would you agree?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that. I basically think that if you are dealing with sexuality, same sex, you're attracted to the same sex. There is a constant process of coming out, and but that doesn't necessarily mean that is the totality of you, or that completely defines you. In my particular personal kind of situation, I fell in love with somebody, and I wanted to actually share that person with not only my family but my friends and my extended sort of community. That was part of my motivation, but also as a woman who knew from a very early age that I was deeply attracted to women. It was a natural part of me being able to also express that and actually take that out into the world. That doesn't totally define me, but it is actually an integral part of who I am, not only for myself but also for my partner and family and those around me.
To me, it's like a coming out is just a term, and it's about it was about being able to share with family. And I was actually quite relieved that coming out existed because I felt like other people had gone through it. I felt like that was another way of sharing. It was something. It's for want of a better way of describing it, a formula in a sense of going, other people have gone through this, so it's going to be okay. Ideally, it gets to a situation where no one has to come out at all. We're just here. That's what happens. But I think it was a positive term for me to listen to. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think I probably agree with Anna, is that you fall in love with someone and then you hope that love, or that sexuality doesn't define you. That's not, you're walking, I'm not walking down the street and everyone's screaming, there's a lesbian there, and I sort of strongly believe that this is just, we're just made up of different people. We're a broad church of humans and just some of us are gay, and that's the way, I wanted to live. When I was on Mardi Gras board, I remember one of the first board meetings I was there, that we had community monies to disperse, and one of the women on the board said, I think it should go to deaf lesbians coming out. And I'm like, oh my God, how many are there, What, the phone rings, there's no one there, you must be a deaf lesbian coming out. So I think... I think the community can get a bit tied up with sort of labels and needs and sort of rituals and cultures and I think we have a fabulous culture. I look at I go to some straight parties and think, thank God I'm not straight, thank God I didn't get married, But like any community and like any culture, we're made up of various people.
Yeah, I agree.
Big jigsaw puzzle.
Now, the coming out narrative is a very familiar one, particularly in film and also in fiction. And I've got some questions I want to ask around that. perhaps, Virginia, starting with you, so many expressions of the coming out narrative traditionally and historically have focused on the fraught and the frightening, the tension of coming out to the family, the fear of being rejected and so on. Why do you think so few people, relatively speaking, have seized on the comedic possibilities of coming out stories?
Oh, I think they have. Hannah Gadsby, I think, talks about her... I think, well...
I'm thinking relatively speaking, though, the bulk of coming out stories are slanted to one side rather than your Hannah Gadsby's and your Tom Ballards turning it into comedy.
I think from any comedy perspective, you know, when it comes from a fraught or angst position, you do find comedy in that, and I think that's where your survival instinct comes out. Mine did when I was rejected. You think, well, this is actually turning into be quite funny and quite a humorous story. I don't know if I know the right answer to that question in terms of, but I do think a lot of people I know have turned that experience into a funny sort of humorous piece, a bit like Wes was talking. I think it was, you know, it does come from a fraught place. I think just being true to yourself and having to share that with loved ones, there's a lot of, you have to be very brave and courageous, and then I don't know what comes in after that.
Anna, coming out stories have been incredibly common to the point of cliche in queer cinema for over a decade, and particularly at Melbourne Queer Film Festival and so on. There will always be coming out stories. They do sometimes rely on a fairly trite formula. Why do you think coming out stories are so ubiquitous in queer cinema, and is it possible to still tell a coming out story in a fresh and new way in film?
Look, it's interesting. I remember when we made Only the Brave and Head On, which both deal with, you know, characters who are either expressing sexuality, certainly in Only the Brave, but, you know, it's certainly not a coming out story, but certainly, you know, desire is expressed very profoundly in that film, and also with Head On, which I guess is, I wouldn't categorise it as a coming out film, but certainly when I've travelled the world with those films and actually attended a lot of, you know, very big international gay and lesbian film festivals, I guess the thing that always struck me was that there was a huge audience and a hunger for those films. And secondly, of course, what we forget as we get older is that every generation has got their own coming out stories. And in some ways, those stories have to be told and retold and reinvented, whether they are, you know, whether they're fun, whether they're serious. Every generation needs to be able to express those ideas and what it means for them to come out. And so we kind of forget that is a generational thing that I think needs to happen in cinema. And you know, and I support that. So I remember when I was doing it way back, you know, a good sort of 15, 20 years ago now with those films, I remember the joy and celebration I felt for, you know, in connecting with my generation around the world, where we kind of were able to share those stories. And so it's always going to be a part of queer cinema. There's just no question about it. And I think rightfully so.
To follow on that, US academic Jan Bacon, I was reading some of her work today in preparation for this, she's argued that coming out stories provide a means of negotiating both individual and collective identity within a cultural context, and particularly a cultural context that marginalises everything queer, and that by emphasising the mechanisms which are our representations of self, i.e. that process, by focusing so much on that process of coming out, that coming out narratives are really at the core of community building. Would you agree? And Tom, you as well?
Coming out stories are the core of community building. Is that what you said? Yes and no. No is probably the more interesting part of my answer. To the extent that, as I alluded to when I spoke at the lectern, I think that coming out stories arguably create their own sort of dominant narratives, which, and I think, you know, I have met in my time people who have had anxieties. Am I gay enough? You know, I didn't know from the age of 4 that I was attracted to people of the same sex, you know, or I've enjoyed having sex with people of the, in inverted commas, opposite sex. Therefore, am I gay enough? My coming out story doesn't match to the traditional coming out narrative, and in that sense, coming out stories can be kind of divisive. And within a community of people, divisive as well. And I guess it's one of the interesting things. But I think there's a power dynamic that operates sometimes in coming out. Don't get me wrong, I think coming out can be very empowering. But when we come out, we disclose, but so often the motivation behind coming out can be what desired reaction do we seek in others? And one of the most used words is acceptance. But it's a very slippery and fast ride from acceptance to seeking acceptance to seeking approval. And acceptance is really it's like that term inclusion. You find yourself perennially placing yourself on the outer, asking to gain entry into some centre, into someone's kingdom. And maybe I think the thing is, if coming out is this generational kind of process or act, I wonder if really the power dynamics behind that will ever change. And the theory that if we continue to come out, things will get better, and in some distant future we may never have to come out, would be great. But I actually wonder if when we come out and the power dynamics behind that and the need for acceptance, and when will we ever get enough acceptance, I actually wonder if that is in a sort of long-term and structural sense disempowering.
I think it's part of our sort of shared storytelling. Like the stories of coming out might not just, it's one of those things you just talk about, and it's that sort of thing that binds you together in a little bit. Not that you have to have a coming out story, or might be something else you experienced with your loved ones or whatever. But to me, it is a sort of shared community storytelling that, I am proud to, of who I am. As I said, I don't want it to define me, but I just think, well, if I was, accepted before, I shouldn't be not accepted because I'm gay. Mm. And maybe that's, I think, part of the storytelling is to say, hey, I'm just the same, but these are the things I've been through.
I do think there is a power in that kind of affiliation with others. So don't get me wrong about that. I agree to that extent, yes.
I don't know. I was just thinking about that, and I certainly think that the reason why it remains relevant is because it is so personal. Mm. And every time someone comes out, it's a highly personal thing that they have to go through. It's an act that they have to actually kind of share that with others. They actually have to explicitly kind of indicate that they're making certain sort of choices, which may be, which may change over time. I just think it's a highly personal act. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I also think that, let's not forget, I don't take a particularly academic approach to this, as in I was a Greek Australian girl growing up in the western suburbs of Melbourne. It was not cool to be gay where I grew up, It was not a kind of a place where you could feel safe to do so. Completely different if you're currently living, for example, in a middle-class suburb in Fitzroy with middle-class Anglo family. And I'm not saying, again, and this is a stereotypical kind of cliched view, but it's possible that a kid in that kind of circumstance may find it easier to come out than, say, I did when I was kind of, 20 in those circumstances. And so there are cultural differences, there are social questions, there are all sorts of issues that are surrounding what it means for young people to come out, particularly. But I think it is a really important thing to support. And part of the reason I'm here is when I hear statistics about young people in this day and age struggling so powerfully with the question of how to come out, struggling so immensely with kind of homophobia and the kind of the social implications and the way that impacts on them as young people. You kind of have to kind of acknowledge that and say it is still happening, it is still difficult, and it is still, for many people, very, very traumatic.
Now, you used the phrase there, Anna, a highly personal act. Wes, you've mined your personal life for your performances. I'm thinking specifically of your show Kiosk, for example, which is about growing up in a kind of in a caravan park, as you said, in the country. It's a very personal and intimate show. That notion of transforming the personal into a work of art is a coming out process for every artist. Would it be fair to say, regardless of whether they're gay or not?
Absolutely, of course. I was going to comment on this before about the comedy aspect. I think people, because comedy is such a personal, especially stand-up style comedy, if you're standing up there being quite raw about your life, then I don't know, to take the piss, it's kind of just makes it a little bit easier, I guess, to do. But what was the question?
Mining the personal.
Mining.
You were doing really well, Wes.
Yeah.
We thought you were actually answering the question, but anyway.
I have a very short attention span, so I forgot what the question was before I answered it.
I'll go off on a bit of a tangent. I don't know if you've read Edmund White's novel A Boy's Own Story, which was published in 1982. When it was published, it became a classic, and it's the story of a teenage boy coming out. But it was jumped on and lauded at the time. But White himself now says of the book, I don't think it's really the coming out gay novel that everyone really needed, even though it was received as such. The boy is too creepy. He betrays his teacher, the only adult man with whom he's enjoyed a sexual experience. Now, for me, that quote raises a couple of interesting questions, one of which is, why did everyone need a coming out novel in the 1980s so badly? And the answer, presumably, is because there were so few representations around of our sexuality. But for you, a question for you, I guess, Wes, and for everybody on the panel, as a community, is the queer community perhaps sometimes too quick to seize upon queer and queer-friendly works of literature and cinema in our need for validation?
Yes, I would agree with that. Absolutely. Do you mean labelling it as queer? As a queer?
Either labelling it as queer, trying to find the queer where it may or may not exist, and perhaps even embracing very mediocre works just because there's nothing else out there.
I find, I definitely find a lot of cynicism when it comes to labelling the work as queer or coming out stories. I think people are, maybe it's just people who have come out or are more comfortable with themselves, but there's just, I don't know if you find this, but people are just going, oh God, not another queer story, not another monologue, someone rambling on about how gay they are and all of that. That happens a lot. And
the cynicism around it happens a lot, you mean?
Yes, the cynicism. Yeah. But I think it's so important. Holding the Man was a book that changed my life, and I read that, and I read that before I came out, and it really did encourage me to, and it was so local as well as Holding the Man. It was set in Melbourne, Tim Conograve, and it was just so important to know that there were other people out there who were going through the same thing. Because as I said when I started before, I felt sick. I felt literally ill until I was 19. I just felt I couldn't figure out why. I didn't know what it was. And not that just coming out was the answer, but it just was this release off my shoulders to say, oh my Lord, there's other people out there who do this as well, who understand who I am. Yeah. Won't say words, like bad ones.
At this point, I want to throw it open to our audience to see if there is anybody has any questions for our esteemed panel. Question down here on the...
After hearing about the giddy cluster of homosexuality in St Kilda sharehouses, have there been any environmental studies to see whether there's a causative factor there?
Well, I lived in Elizabeth Bay, and that was Betty Gay. Honestly, I think. Look, in Sydney, there is a ghetto. I do believe there is a ghetto. And I think this was the argument we had a lot on Mardi Gras board was, are we preaching to, the converted in a way? We should be actually getting out into regional New South Wales, Lismore, where there were problems. But, we do... well, in Sydney, we tend to cluster together.
I think it's because of the Prince of Wales Hotel. Actually, because there's a gay bar and a straight one next to each other, so you can kind of sneak in and pretend.
To me, one of the things that question does raise, though, it acknowledges the commonalities, the shared experiences. And, for example, the phrase "a terrifying silence" was used by you, Virginia, and Anna, you used the phrase "an unspeakable chasm" that opened up. So that, and even in my family, on a less dramatic kind of way, there was that silence that we aren't going to speak about this now. And again, the share household experience. Talking to Christos Chalkis, for example, about his first novel, that notion of moving into a share house and falling in love was something that happened with him as well. It's happened in many people. That notion of the freedom that comes with moving out of home into a new house, moving into state to a city where people don't know you. How important is that freedom to coming out?
Well, I had freedom in a way, which was an unfortunate one because my parents died young and I wasn't out before then. So to me, if out of all that bad, one good thing was I was liberated. I could do whatever I wanted to do. But when I did move to Sydney, I did get into the community. Well, the community was so warm and accepting. It was just an amazing feeling to be there. And I did work for Mardi Gras and I was on the board. And not that I was in the scene. I really didn't want to be sort of like, you're a scene sort of person. But it was an amazingly great feeling for me to be in that sort of tribe. It was a tribal sense, and I'll never forget that. And it has made me, stronger. And I do think the community is too serious sometimes. I do, Alana Valentine and I used to sit on the board and we'd argue that, it's not good art if you just put some tits and a dick there. That's not art. Let's try and mine the plays. Let's try and mine the stories. Let's actually define the culture through art. Not necessarily coming out stories, but other things. We make up most of the arts community anyway. Why aren't we producing better stuff for the Mardi Gras?
Well, that's something that Helen Razor will be talking about here tomorrow. Another question.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what panel members think about this whole question of gay marriage, in the sense of, it seems to me, this sort of desire for to be just like the straight community. And I guess in my life, with all the traumas of coming out and being gay and all the rest of it, one of the delights was we aren't straight. So maybe just to have some thoughts about that.
No, please.
Well, interestingly, my first opening statement is that I actually believe in equality of rights, and I think that it's really important to affirm the fact that really there should be. My own personal view is that there should be, gay and lesbians should have the right to get married. I believe in. Essentially, if that is your choice, that we should have those rights like anyone else. However, on a personal level, for me, I have no desire to get married. I've been in a long-term relationship, and in fact I've been in a committed relationship with Mira for 25 years. I have no desire to actually kind of bring that the idea of marriage into our lives. And certainly it's not something that I feel any kind of sense of, wanting to do, because I also like my difference. I enjoy and relish the fact of who I am, in a way, and there's a celebratory quality, I think, to that idea for me. So yes, in some ways, I find the whole institution of marriage for me personally problematic.
Tom?
Well, personally, I feel some ambivalence towards marriage. But, it's interesting because I think that maybe sometimes among queer people, if you, say, for example, are a lesbian and you want to get married, people can be quite quick to say, you're just conforming with heterosexuals, you're following some assimilationist impulse or something like that. Whereas it can actually just be that you might simply be a lesbian and you might want to get married, and it doesn't actually mean that you're a conservative, traditional type of lesbian. And so I think there's often some sort of conflation around people's interest in marriage or not interest, and what that may or may not say about their political leanings in general. But for myself, I think part of my ambivalence around it is that I wonder if it will only reinforce. It's said that if we allow same-sex couples to get married, that we can expand the notion of the concept of marriage. But I actually wonder if it sort of will, in some ways, just reinforce the concept of marriage as only pertaining to particular types of people, and still leaving other kinds of relationships on the outer. For example, I'm in an open relationship, and who knows? I have one partner, but who knows? Maybe I might like to have more than one partner. Maybe my partner might like to as well. But I would see it. I could not picture a government that would allow marriage within that kind of framework for me. And so marriage, I find, on the one hand, not something that I would rule out, because I might like to marry my partner someday. But at the same time, I'm aware that marriage still remains this rather exclusive concept, and you will only broaden it to a certain extent if you allow same-sex couples to be married. And additionally, I also find the terms same-sex and opposite sex not meaningful to me, because I'm not really sure what is the same sex to me or what is the opposite sex to me.
Mm-hmm. We're running out of time, so quick comments from either of you?
I need a watermelon baller, so no, I think people should have the right to do whatever they want, but I don't know why David Jones is not pushing same-sex marriage. It'll make the registries double the size, and boom. But no, I'm happy not to be married.
Yeah, I think I've been single for 12 years, so the likelihood of that happening. I was going to do a show called I Take Me and just marry myself. I think it's so important for equality. But just not relevant to me, because I make my own rules. If I did meet someone and we fell in love, I wouldn't worry about getting married in a church anyway or anything. I would just get married in our own way in Hawaii in a spa.
Well, we have basically run out of time. So, ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel. And thank you very much for coming to another part of the Big Gay Week here at the Wheeler Centre. Check the website. There are more events happening over the next couple of days, as I've already mentioned. And thank you very much for coming, and good night.